All right, welcome everybody to this live learning session. For us on the eastern side of Australia, this is the first evening session that we've had as a live learning, and super excited to have our guest with us, Kyle Wagner, joining us from overseas in Hong Kong. Is that where you are right now, Kyle, by the way?
Yes, I'm in a huge 400 square foot apartment.
Awesome. I'm Dan. I'm the Director of Professional Learning with Future Anything. I'm joining you from Brisbane, Mianjin, and I'm super excited to have this conversation this afternoon around taking students from being passive to active. What does student-led learning look like? That's what we're going to dive into this afternoon. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm gathering from and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the lands that you're all gathering from too. We love to ask our audience for live learning to jump on the chat and let us know where you are, where you're gathering from, and the First Nation land group where you are. So please do that. We love to see where everybody is joining us from around Australia and around the world. And if you are an international guest with us today, we are super excited to have you with us. So welcome. Now, this is being recorded. So this is the little message to make sure that you're aware that we are recording, and it will be available after today's session. We'll send it out post-session. Today, we're super excited to be able to give away some of Kyle's book. So Where is the Teacher is Kyle's latest book. And to get that, all you have to do is just be engaged. Join the conversation. Give us a comment through the chat. Ask a question. Add a comment. Whatever it might be, just engage. We'd love to see you part of the conversation, and then we'll choose some people for copies of the book and announce that in the post-session email, and I'll be in touch for details on where to send it. So let's kind of get a little bit started, and maybe the first opportunity for you to share in the chat. I'd love to know, as a little bit of a background, what does student-led learning look like in your setting currently? What might it be? What does it feel like for you? Where are you at on the journey with you and your students in a student-led learning context? So jump in the chat, let us know. And in the background, we're going to keep a track of what is being mentioned, what's being said. We'll put some ideas, resources, tools, and strategies through the chat and send it all out as well post-session. So, as I mentioned, we're joined from Hong Kong by Kyle Wagner, internationally recognized educator, author, student-centered learning designer, project-based learning guru, and the author of the book, Where is the Teacher, which we're going to unpack a little bit tonight as well. Kyle works with the International Montessori School of Hong Kong, and we are super privileged that he's given us his time this evening, to have a bit of a chat around all things student-led learning. Now, Kyle, what I love to do is with each guest kind of dive into what is the origin story or the founding story of what kind of pulled you into this work. And to kind of give you a bit of an insight, for me, I was in school leadership as a principal, and I love that work, and it's what brought me to the work that I'm doing now with Future Anything. But it was really a moment for me as a teacher when I was leading some whole school initiative in an action research project as a teacher. And it was really in that moment that I realized what I loved the most was the change process. I was energized by working at the level of strategic thinking and implementation, being of service at a whole school level, professional development, coaching, mentoring, and change management. And so through that process, it triggered and sparked in me wanting to be a school leader. And what I didn't have language for at the time was I was actually experiencing agency and real ownership over my work. And so what I'd love to know is, as you tell us a bit about yourself, what led you to your work? And was there a moment or a student or a classroom that solidified your vision?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Dan. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. And yeah, thanks for providing this particular space. I have several moments. I think back to childhood when I was given agency to be a peer mediator and support peers through conflicts.
Mm.
Apparently, I was good at mediating conflict, probably because I had so many conflicts with my brothers. I'm one of four, and we were always fighting, quadruplet. Another side story, but I'd like to actually zoom in to a moment where I saw it in full action. And this was a moment when I got a pink slip as a teacher. And I think everyone who's kind of tuning in can kind of experience this when you're lowest on the totem pole, you're young, and it comes that time where they have to let some teachers go. There are budget cuts. And I was a young, enthusiastic teacher, but doesn't matter how enthusiastic you are, it matters how many years of service you provided. And they said, sorry, we got to pink slip you. So, I thought it was devastating at the time, but I started looking for my options. And I heard of this school. They said, you've got to check out this school. It's more of a summer camp than it is a school. And the place is called High Tech High. And if you're familiar with High Tech High, or you've seen the documentary Most Likely to Succeed, based off that documentary, how agentic this place was. I got to experience that firsthand. So I signed up to go to this interview. It's called a Bonanza Day. And they call it a bonanza because they literally put you through this bonanza all day. And it's mostly run by kids, the whole process. So I'm greeted at the door. I am greeted at the door and I look through and I'm expecting it to be an office. It's really this large atrium space. And I'm greeted by two teenagers with plaid shirts on. And they said, hello, we've been waiting for you, Kyle. And, my first response was, my name is Mr. Wagner, okay? Like that, you got to call me by my last name. Like that's the first thing you learn in teacher school. Um, but I said, okay, well, most people call me Mr. Wagner, but you can call me Kyle. And they said, okay, well, Mr. Kyle, let's show you High Tech High. And behind them, I did not see any adults. I saw kids, building, tinkering. I saw things hanging from the ceiling, like this engineering contraption, is wheels, and showing the gears and how those things turn and how they worked. You saw shadow boxes, even above the actual bathroom itself. You have this project work. And immediately I was struck with, is this kind of like this airport hangar that's been turned into a school? And I'm trying to wrap my mind around it. And the whole time I'm thinking, where are the adults? Where are the adults? They take me back to where the classroom spaces are. I'm like, where are the adults? They're like, oh, you'll find them eventually. And in this space where these two classrooms sit on this joining space because it's interdisciplinary. They had the humanities teacher, they had a science teacher, and these kids were out in the middle of the space putting together um, this little simple machine, and they're rolling this thing up this ramp. One kid, I might be embellishing this story, so you know these are maybe extra details that didn't happen, but I swear they got this thing to work, and through these levers that are pulling and get this thing up a ramp, and they high five. They're like, yes, we know how the Egyptians built the pyramids. And then adult comes out, he's got like shorts on, he looks like a hippie from the 70s, and he got high fives the kids and he goes, good job, and that's
Mm.
when I knew like there's something special about this place. And I won't go into too many more details, but that day the students interviewed me. There was a student panel that would, sitting with the adults to determine if I got hired or not. I had to plan a project with the team, on the fly within 10, 15 minutes. So this is really kind of this shift
Mm.
in what it looks like when really we're empowering students to be decision makers, have choice within the projects that they
Yes.
take, the actual uniforms that they wear, what they call the teachers. There's no bells at this school. So this is the origin story of a long love affair I had, that began there, with student agency.
I love that. And look, you can embellish any story. My dad always said that you don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. I'm good with that. And I think what you started to unpack there really resonates with the work that I do and that we do at Future Anything. In fact, our pedagogical model, and I might even be able to kind of throw it up here for you to have a look at. We really sit at the intersection of project-based learning, human-centered design, and entrepreneurial pedagogy. And so, we take from PBL Works, the Buck Institute, the gold standard of project-based learning, because these 8 elements give some fidelity and rigor to the work and help it to be credible. It's not just about a project at the end of a unit. And I know that your roots are in, of course, PBL too, and High Tech High, as you've mentioned, one of the most recognizable PBL schools in the world. We also kind of have this human-centered design lens around divergent and convergent thinking and iteration. And of course, we then have entrepreneurial pedagogy or capabilities that we believe and is part of the work. And so my question for you is, for those at home who hear terms like project-based learning, inquiry, student-centered learning, what do these actually mean for you? Where do they overlap? How do they differ? And how do you approach them in your work?
Yeah, no, and thanks for sharing that model, right? And frameworks are good. Frameworks are good to kind of, I think, solidify or put concrete what we're looking for in terms of what we're offering students. But where frameworks are sometimes limiting is that we have so many of these things, right, in education, they don't necessarily address what does that day to day look like, right, with kids.
Mm.
And I'd say the first start with anything, right? Let's start with agency and voice and choice. I think that's a large umbrella. Project-based learning, inquiry-based learning is ways to get at students having more voice and choice, within their learning. And I think we get a lot hung up on the terminology. I've had people go, is this problem-based learning or project-based learning? Or is it
Mm.
place-based learning? Or is it inquiry-based learning? I'm like, well, like all of the above, I think, it's about kids making decisions around the kind of work that they're going to do, the kind of questions that they're going to pursue. And I think rather than introducing more frameworks, we introduce to a classroom to teachers, say what voice and choice do students have in terms of where they sit, in terms of the kind of work that they're taking on, in terms of the kind of questions that they are addressing. Do you take a topic and find out what kids are interested in related to that topic and then kind of go from there, or maybe present 2 or 3 different ways that you're delivering the topic, or have some choice when it comes to what they are producing? Because learning is not a complicated process, right? I mean, we do it in school and out of school, right? It stems from really this motivation, this curiosity. It's not driven by this grade or this external measure that we're going to get, right? Sometimes that helps. But like, I think at the starting point is finding out within our classrooms, within our schools, what is of interest to our students? What are they talking about? How do we relate our curriculum to things that are relevant in their lives? And the first step to doing that is to have this dialogue. Rob Reardon of High Tech High, one of my heroes, who I'm going to talk a little bit about because he did provide a bit of a framework without knowing it. He said, we're not a project-based school, we're a dialogue school. And I think High Tech High and all these other schools would love to be known less for, okay, we're the king of project-based learning, inquiry-based learning, student agency, and more that we give kids agency and voice, right? And it's a constant dialogue back and forth, between learner and teacher around, what they're learning, why they're learning it, what choices that they have in terms of that learning. And, that adult takes more of a egalitarian role, I would say. They're still obviously authority in the classroom. They're still respected, but they take that role of learner alongside. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. Look, I'm interested to dive a little bit further into, we talk about agency and voice. So for us in our work, we're very interested by some research around, we believe that agency is the product of being able to, for young people to be able to wield capabilities like creative thinking, critical thinking, agility, curiosity. So there are 6 in our future anything capability framework. What does agency really mean for you, and what are some good examples of that the agency that you're looking to develop in your young people?
Yeah, I think those are all good, right? I mean, some people talk about the C's, right? Critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, communication, curiosity. It doesn't deviate, far from that. I have a framework that I've developed, and it's around these shifts towards agency. And some of those things are inquiry, right? Who's doing the questioning? Is it the teacher doing the questioning? And sometimes that's good, right? They have a central inquiry, right? They follow that. That's engaging for kids. But how much voice are we giving students in developing their own questions? right? And how are we eliciting that from students? So that's one of the shifts that we look for when we're talking about, agency. Another one of the shifts we're looking for is in terms of how we're presenting this information. Is it in isolated subjects? Is it like I go to a classroom and then every teacher has a different set of expectations? Or is it in this more kind of interdisciplinary fashion, which is the way things work in the real world, right? Another thing is this a collaborative experience for agency, right? Do students have a little bit of choice in terms of, are they working just isolated and it's just a didactic conversation between you and the teacher, or is it a collaborative conversation where they can learn from each other and peers, right? Because agency
Mm.
means I have agency for where this learning is coming from. And if it's only coming from the teacher, this two-way street, then, it's not very agentic. So that's one of the shifts, as well. Another one of the shifts is to look at who's leading the discussion. When you do have a discussion, are we giving students an opportunity to lead and facilitate those discussions, right? Are we giving peers opportunity to lead each other? And how does the teacher set up the scenarios, whether it's a book discussion or a book club maybe that they're having, whether it's an article or something, a reading kids bring in, or just a topic that they're interested in exploring, how's
Mm.
that being facilitated? And then there's, this idea of a audience for work. Who is the audience for that piece of work? Is it the teacher for a grade, or is it a more relevant, authentic audience? Because of course the kids can have agency when their work is meaningful to someone beyond the classroom. So, I have a few of those shifts that we're looking for that, has kind of been a bit of a model around what I think agency looks like.
Yeah. And when you talk about those shifts, do you find that there are any, for want of a better term, more important than another, or do you find that one amplifies another and should come earlier? What are the real signs that you're looking for that might continue to enhance the process and the learning?
Yeah, and I will get really super concrete for this because I know teachers like concrete. So think about your classroom, right? And I'm thinking about the classrooms that I'm supporting in the IMS middle school. It's a Montessori middle school, right? And it's supposed to be super progressive, and in many ways it is. However, when it comes to the design of the classroom, we asked the students, how would you like this space to be designed? And we said you can design it any way you wanted. We were thinking it was going to be very creative, right? They're going to have bean bags and couches and everything. They lined up in a U, everyone facing the teacher, right? Which I thought was interesting. Uh, and,
Mm.
one of the things you could do, okay, we gave them agency, but I've noticed that it's been a lot of like when it's math class or something else, it's set up in this very teacher-centered way, right? With this one-on-one conversation, a kid raises a hand and shares. One of the easiest ways, I would say a shift, is to put your tables together, make things collaborative, because the conversation then becomes supported, or whatever the learning is, by the peers amongst that group, rather than it being always kind of teacher centered, teacher facing. And this sounds super simple, and everyone maybe already does this, but it is a really a highly effective way to change the flow of the conversation. So just grouping your tables together in table groups and having different roles. Someone's maybe that discussion leader. You have a prompt that you have up front, right? And or you have a particular activity.
Mm.
That's a shift that is, moving from siloed to collaborative. I think another shift, I mentioned it, was starting things with questions, big questions, rather than content. Like, hey, here's chemistry. We're going to explore the periodic table. We're going to look at different elements and run some experiments.
Mm.
Rather than that, looking at, okay, how can we use our understanding of chemistry to 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 tackle some real world problems, right? And to look at the water issues within our community or something, right? Just questions are a lot more open-ended questions are going to be a lot more compelling to students rather than, starting with a content. So those are a couple of the shifts I think are going to make a lot of headway.
Yeah, I love that. And I think there'll be people listening or with us tonight who are thinking, yes, but how do I do that? What does it look like? I'd love to kind of talk to you about what are some of the challenges or the barriers or the things that come up that can get in the way. And how have you tackled some of those big challenges in your work?
All right, so I'm seeing it in the chat window. Like Catherine mentioned one, curriculum, right? A constraint,
Mm.
structured curriculum. Definitely, curriculum can be a constraint from, fully student-led learning. Time, right? People are like, well, I don't have the time for that because my curriculum, not only is it structured, no, I can't deviate it, there's a lot of it, maybe to potentially cover. Some of the structures that they have don't allow for this kind of collaborative teacher planning, or they have a very large population of students, 30, 35 students, right? It's not a smaller group that they can find out, how to make these things, more personalized. So, there is definitely a lot of these constraints. And I like to tell, I said I was going to tell stories, so I'll tell another story. And I think this might illuminate for some people. This person's working in the inner city. They're a teacher, they're a language and English teacher. And I don't know if it's big in Australia. You've probably seen the movie. It's called The Great Gatsby. Like, have you guys heard of that one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like part of like the standard, literature that everybody's got to read in high school. And I worked with her on, okay, how engaged are the kids in this book? And she's like, they're not engaged. They're like, they're inner city kids. They don't relate at all. They're not rich. They're not white, and they don't relate at all to that lifestyle, right? And I can't get them into this particular book. So we looked at, okay, what kind of shifts can we make? She made only a few shifts. They still read the book, but the first shift she made was, what is a big open-ended question related to that big theme of that book that is meaningful to them? The American dream is what it's all about, right? Is the American dream still alive? How can we redefine the American dream to be more applicable to our community, right? And it gives me goosebumps just thinking about the question, because that was one shift. Now all of a sudden the kids are kind of interested. Well, what does the American dream look like? They were then tasked, they're reading the book, so they're following along with the different characters of the book. They're relating it to real world characters. Well, who are their real world characters? Here's another shift. Actually, the shift is, what does it look like in our community? They looked at the custodian at their school, people who started a YMCA who decided to teach in their school, the unsung heroes of their community. They started to get to know them and talking about their American dream. They were interviewing them. Teacher asked, well, what do you want to do with those stories? The kids, then here's another shift, real world work, right? The kids, instead of just writing a book report, which is, boring for so many kids, they're putting together podcasts, and each different story of the people that they're interviewing is becoming featured on this podcast. And it's called Sueños Unidos. It's bilingual, by the way, now. They're getting the Spanish teacher involved as well. And the kids took it a step further. They even created a YouTube preview for this. They professionally recorded. They had some people coming in who, one girl had her own podcast, right? And so like, oh, you have your own podcast. You can help us, help us produce this thing. Group the tables together. They're featuring different stories. And these are 3 or 4 shifts. And she had the same constraints. She had a big class. She had a pretty set curriculum. She had a book she had to explore. And she's made a few shifts. And all of a sudden now it's opened up this agency. She shifted her role, and it's made a huge impact.
To kind of segue further into that, I've seen it come up to the chat here around assessment, connection to assessment. Where does assessment fit for you? How do you bring the authenticity of the real world learning that you're talking about and connect it authentically to what assessment looks like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I really don't like the word assessment, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
in general, I think it's a very teacher word, or we think of assessment as like a checkbox kind of thing, right? If you think of it in the real world, like
Mm.
I don't know, I like to say demonstration of learning, right? More, or how they articulate their learning, and that can be done in so many ways, right? And in this kind of a project-based setting, that could be done in the actual presentation itself, the exhibition
Mm.
of their learning. That could be in a journal that they're keeping along the way to show their process. And we talk about the use of AI and how like AI is going to be the death of education. Well, for at least the old way we did it. Well, it's not if students are having to document the process throughout the way of getting to wherever they're going. So that's a demonstration of learning. Another demonstration of learning are these one-on-one conversations all the time. When kids are doing a bunch of project work, we have our teachers who will pull the kids into a little office and ask them about, the different concepts, whether that's a piece of work that they're producing or a little quiz that they might have given them or a written assignment. And, they're still evaluating and learning throughout this process, but it becomes a longer journey. And that assessment, if we want to call it that at the end, is not, assessment of the learning, it's assessment of the whole process. And you have multiple pieces of evidence along the way for how to assess. So I think we just need to expand,
Mm.
our viewpoint of what assessment is and get a little bit more creative in terms of, how we're evaluating learning.
Yeah, I love that. And in our work, we prefer to use celebration rather than talking about assessment. In
I
our
like that.
work, we also do some work with systems and schools around what co-design looks like and inviting students to the planning and when that occurs. And so we like to talk about getting students involved in the process right from the beginning, way before the unit's even ready to be taught. Can you talk to us a little bit about what does co-design look like in your work, and what are some really good examples of it?
Yeah, that's it. That's great. Co-design actually in terms of anyone's work, your work, my work, High Tech Eye's work, PBL work, everybody's work. Co-design is the goal, I think. And that is one of the toughest shifts, right? And when is that introduced? You're quite brave for doing the co-design that early on, right? And giving kids that much agency. For teachers who maybe don't have that much and they have
Mm,
potentially set topics that they have to explore, you know, they might ask students early on, hey, here are three or four different ideas for the way I'm exploring this particular topic, like planets, maybe, or space and space science. Which of these
mm,
interests you the most, right? And it's just a quick form. And, that's what we've used, and we're getting kids' input. And, then we start to design around those particular topics that they're most interested in. Like co-design in terms of how they're going to demonstrate their learning is another opportunity as well, right? Like what kind of projects might you engage in? We're doing an ecosystems unit beginning. It's all around migrations and animal and plant migrations as a result of climate change. Well,
mm.
how would you like to demonstrate your learning? Hey, here's 4 or 5 different organizations we're thinking about visiting. Which of these would be of most interest to you? Which particular ecosystem? Are you interested in the marine ecosystem? Are you interested in the mangroves? Are you interested in the rainforest? Which of these interests you the most, right?
Mm.
So I think of these all as, simple ways. I talked to one program and they said every week they'd give their kids a feedback form of some sort. They'd
Hmm.
preview what was coming, what interests you out of this, and what suggestions maybe that you have. So co-design is just like I said with this high tech high thing. It's just this conversation back and forth.
Yeah, I love that. And look, part of the process for us is about getting feedback from students and testing assumptions, and going through, involving students in the learning from the beginning, and also helping them to work through what does the journey look like for them, what might assessment look like, and how can they be involved. We've got a lot
Mm.
of things happening in the chat here, and I'd love to open the floor to some questions that we've got here. I'm going to invite Nick to jump on because hopefully Nick's been running, checking the chat a little bit better. What have we got, Nick, in the way of questions?
There's lots of chat. People are very eager for books. I'm not saying that people are chatting because they want books, but I suspect that the conversation fury that's happening in the chat is because people are motivated by free stuff.
Mm.
And you know what? I applaud it. I love it, guys. I get around it.
Yeah.
um, I'm interested, actually, there's a couple of really curious questions. I would love to dig into, I can't find who said it. I'll go back, but how do you convince maybe leadership that this approach is still rigorous and valid? And like we've drunk the Kool-Aid, right? Like if we've turned up at 7:30 at Eastern
Mm.
time, like we're eager and we're in and we know that it works. But what if your line manager or your leader that you're working with has not drunk the Kool-Aid? Like, what can you do in order to push this up and make sure that you can grow it within a school context that might not be sitting here vying for free books at 7:30 in the evening?
Oh, okay. Well, if I was taking the coaching approach, I'd ask, "What's your hunch?" Nick, or whoever asked that particular question. But since I'm chomping at the bit to share what's been like most impactful of moving the
Mm.
needle for leaders that I've had who might not be supportive of this, I will take a stab at it. The first thing I would say is invite them in. Invite them in, whether it's in the process of this agentic learning you're leading and students are all busy doing their project work, or if it's an exhibition where they're putting on this learning at the end and they're sharing what they've done. Because I can picture, and I'm saying this person was supportive of us. So, but I think it still illustrates the effectiveness and the power of this. We are running our student business, and there's questions. What about the rigor involved? Yes, that's great. Kids are making some cookies, and they're selling it. Like, but what about the rigor of like opportunity costs and supply and demand and all these other business terms? And so we had an investor pitch, and we said, okay, we're gonna put on a pitch, and we invited the administration to our school leaders in, and they could sit on the panel for the kids as they presented their business. They went through the financials, the potential projected, revenue for their business, the different roles that they had within the business, how they were going to market it. And they started talking about all of this, like market research they had conducted, the data and what the trends were. And you could see that the like eyes getting wide, on these leaders, and like their mouths dropping. And I specifically remember one leader going, it was a one teacher actually who said, is that's Mark. That was my student last year. Like, what happened? And like this literally was a student that 5 or 6 months ago, they might have said like, okay, we've got to find a different school for this particular, kid, because they can't cut it here. Because, you invite those leaders in and they see the kids articulating their learning in such empowered and academic sense, then that immediately then begs the next question of like, okay, like when can we chat? When can we chat a little bit about kind of what I've been doing in my classroom, and seeing how we can maybe more people on board, or for inquiry-based learning or project-based learning. And usually the conversation is welcomed at that point.
I always think that, and this is, I'll say this, I'll say it plainly, but like principals don't like to say no to things that make the school look good. And so if you have this beautiful celebration of learning and the principal comes along and community's there and the local council is like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you young people can do this. That's sometimes the easiest way to get a yes for the next step, is because you've demonstrated the impact that the learning has had on the broader community. Dan's heard this story a bunch of times, but one of my first forays into this pedagogy was a Romeo and Juliet unit. And it was with a group of year 10 extension students, very academic young people. And I got the green light from my head of department to run a pilot project-based learning unit with my class. And so I often say to teachers, like, get the green light to pilot something closed within your curriculum and use it as like a test case to build an evidence base why the pedagogy and the process works. And so I took all this pre-data around young people's engagement, attention, their attendance, their like every metric that I could gather as a benchmark I took. And then instead of running the analytical essay, I had students explore the driving question of how does action or an inability to take action result in change? And so we looked at Romeo and Juliet from the lens of, whether people did something or didn't do something, something happened. And so we had this like map of the story around the room, where I had the students hypothesize how things may have played out differently for different characters if they'd made different decisions. Like if an adult at any point had adulted in Romeo and Juliet, maybe the two young people wouldn't be dead at the end of the play, any of those things. And so then I had the students produce a project that demonstrated how action or an inability to take action resulted in change. And they did some cool stuff. My favorite was two boys who I kind of wanted to strangle for most of the unit, who developed this 15-minute mockumentary about this condition they'd created called IDM, which was immature decision making. And so they used the biology of the brain to justify why young people couldn't make good decisions. And they had their friends dress up as fake doctors to talk about the treatment plan for sufferers of IDM. And then I had them write an analytical essay that connected the play to their project. And I used that as the summative connection that I could leverage with my HOD. And then I took all the benchmark data at the end and presented back to my head of department the shifts that I had in engagement and achievement and attendance, and even the qualitative responses from the students about their favorite parts of the learning, the fact that they were staying back at lunch breaks to do the work, the fact that I had all these emails from parents talking about how tapped in their students were. And I leveraged data, which is often used to weaponize teachers' work, but I used that data to leverage how this pedagogy could serve some of our most top performing learners. And so I think the celebration angle is so powerful. And like, if I could add anything to this conversation, it would be like for people in the room to get smart with the way that they use data to prove that the work that they're doing in the classroom is working for young people.
Yeah, that's super powerful. I love the question too, because the question is universal and it's not confined to a subject. You even said the kids were doing the, brain stuff or inability to make a decision, right? So it's like crosses so many other besides literature, Romeo and Juliet. And I'll just add to what you said about the data, right? The data doesn't have to always come in the standard form, but think about what is important to your leaders. Okay. It's
Yes.
not what's important to you. It's not what is important to you. Like, you got to divorce yourself from like, look how excited the kids are. They're happy. They're joyful. Like, that's our KPI. Like, we are, that's our key performance indicator. And in fact, someone in Hong Kong asked me, like, what's your KPI? And I was like, my kids are happy when they leave my class. Like, does that count? You know? But no, they're looking for what do they care about? Our parents' scores are big for them. Academic, like, you know, we're in Asia, right? This is the world we live in. So if you can connect those and show that, hey, guess what? The kids are also super engaged as well, then, you know, it's a big win.
I'm going to ask the next question that's in the list off the back of that, because you use the word that I'm going to use to lead in. And I think in our Australian context at the moment, this Claudia's question, I think, is particularly pertinent. I talk about us having a pedagogy war at the moment. We've got like explicit and direct instruction on one side, and we've got all of the hippies on the other side with project and inquiry-based learning. And like, never shall the two meet. You're either one side or the other. And I find it really frustrating, because for me, I'm like pedagogy for purpose. And you actually can't do great inquiry or great project-based learning or problem-based learning or place-based learning or whatever we're doing without really strong, rigorous, explicit and direct instruction to build the foundations for young people to then explore. So putting that aside, how do you measure or balance maybe a school that may have quite an academic a very strict academic remit around what success looks like, and maybe young people who are pursuing quite traditional ATAR pathways? How do you marry this blend of inquiry, project-based, student-led learning alongside maybe some of the marketing positioning of a traditional academic ATAR pathway in a traditional academic school?
Well, I would say that the easy answer to that is make sure it doesn't detract, whatever that inquiry-based, project-based learning, detract from the results that they're hoping to get. So, you know, I'll give you a case study. There's a school, I won't name this school because I think they're super innovative, but they have a somewhat rigid curriculum. And if anyone's British here, sorry, I apologize, you know, but I do think the IGCSE, the A levels, right, I think could be a bit rigid. You know, and that particular school is following that. And you know, so if they're going to be like inquiry-based, project-based learning, it's like, no way is that going to work for the community, for the legacy they built, for the parents, the teachers. So they said, okay, we're still going to do all of that. We're still going to we're going to deviate just a bit for one particular unit. We're going to have teachers kind of come together, do something interdisciplinary. You could still keep, you know, the same content. Look at your content for the year and see how you can merge these two. And you know, that particular shift, I think, allowed them to see, oh, okay, we actually can do this, and our content can connect, and maybe we can start making these connections. They'll still learn in their isolated classrooms, but yet it'll be connected around a bigger topic. And then the needle's slowly starting to shift. You know, my shirt here, you got, I don't know if you could see it, but it's like a needle for like teacher-led, student-centered. Yeah. So I'm like, what's going to move the needle a bit for that? And maybe that's similar. I don't know the whole context, you know, of, because I'm only watching the Australia situation from afar. But I would say that the minute then you tell somebody you don't have to throw out everything you've been doing, or I'm not negating your approach to learning, right? And we're having a conversation, actually, maybe both are valuable, right? Maybe they can't all be merged immediately, but you know, we can make some steps towards that direction. And I tell you what, you've seen this probably as well. I have never met someone that I've introduced this to and they've done it that didn't become a believer in it. Like I'm yet to find that person who's like, nope, didn't work at all, hated it, I'm never doing that ever again. I mean, so maybe that's a way just to marry them.
Can I add another layer to it? Because that's a top level. And I think maybe the other argument that Claudia is like leaning into in her comment too, which I want to take down another level, is the schools that are most progressively looking at some of these often place this kind of pedagogy within alternative programs or programs where young people are at risk of disengagement from school. But rarely, I think, do we see this as like a pathway for some of our most academic achievers. And I'd love to maybe press you on what advantage do you see, even for an academic young person, for them to have exposure to this pedagogy, to like a student-led agentic approach in classrooms? Like, what's the payoff for that young person? What growth do you see when that pedagogy becomes a part of the experience for a young person?
Um, maybe I'll frame it with more of that. I think the value of a student that might have a more practical based approach to learning, right? Because we separate things like vocational or academic, right? And then we say, okay, for the academic leaning student, we're gonna have a really, really rigorous curriculum. And then, as you mentioned, for that disengage, the at risk, we're gonna have more project-based curriculum. And I think the way to shift that is that we have to have more of an opportunity for these highly, highly academic kids to be working together with the at-risk, kid, right? Like if we have these tracks, which we're like, oh, you're the vocational track, oh, you're the academic track, then we're going to continue to see these two different camps. But I'll give you a case in point. My Futures Academy at International School of Beijing, they wanted to start a program and let me tell you, International School of Beijing, look it up. They have kids going to Ivy League schools. They were one of the most reputable schools for academics in this particular part of the world. And they introduced this idea of a Futures Academy, which can be project based. And people are like, what? Like, why? There is no need for this. Like, and the idea was, well, in the future, you're going to have a lot more of these other skills like communication, collaboration. And so we started this program, Futures Academy, and I'm sharing this story of this kid who was very, very academic focused. But when it came to that unit around business, and there were a lot of academics, as I mentioned to you, around entrepreneurship, we were making sure it was rigorous. It wasn't just like a lemonade stand. They could develop their own businesses. He struggled immensely, and he developed a business, which it was a board game. He spent 6 weeks trying to develop a board game and sold it to 0 people. The only person he sold it to was the teacher because the teacher felt bad for him. This is a kid who has the top scores in everything. And so I'm sharing that because it like finally exposed, and some other kids actually were elevated quite high, but in that same class, and then maybe they're partnered with him. We're actually in the same class. Now we're starting to highlight those other kids. So I think the integration has to happen, because otherwise we're going to still have these two different camps of like the highly academic, high others. And yes, you can ensure and show that inquired project-based learning is highly rigorous, highly academic. But I think blending the two, and highlighting different students within the actual class who are demonstrating these skills, and we'll start to change that conversation.
I know Dan's going to want to jump in here. I just need to jump in real quick. I could see he was about to start coming up. I just need to say one thing, Dan, okay? In one of the early pilots we did of the project, we split, we had 4 classes running a project-based inquiry unit. 2 were academic selective entry classes. We had 1 mainstream. I'm using these labels really loosely. Please don't judge me. They're just for storytelling purposes. Within each class, there was a spectrum of young person that existed underneath these generic labels I'm using, a mainstream class and then a sporting merit class. But what I found really fascinating, and the data's replicated, is the young people who engaged in project and inquiry-based learning on the first occasion, we saw increase by half a grade to a grade when they were tapped into and where they had voice and choice and could apply what they knew within an open context. What we saw for the academic high achievers, if they were at an A, they dropped half a grade to a grade the first experience they had with project-based learning. What I noticed was they were fearful of red pen. So these are young people that have mastered the art of like hearing stuff from the teacher and regurgitating it back in the right order and rarely confront feedback. And therefore they don't have great fitness about receiving and applying feedback. The nature of an inquiry or a project-based learning unit is that you're consistently kind of pivoting. You're kind of taking on feedback and then you're growing, and you're taking on feedback and growing. And the hungrier you can be about the feedback, the better you get. Now, they really struggled with that experience. However, when you expose them to a project or an inquiry-based unit within that sort of 6 to 12 month period, that muscle reactivates, right? And so you don't see that significant academic drop. But I do remember my principal hauling me into the classroom and going, "You've ruined these students before NAPLAN. Like, please explain." And I was like, "How good is the data?" And he's like, "Not how good, Nicole, not how good." And I was like, "But we've finally found an environment where these young people can't game the assessment system anymore. I found their growth edge. And so now we can work with them at that growth edge." And so the challenge is those are the young people that go into university, and there's documented research everywhere, and they struggle in their post-secondary pathways because they've been spoon-fed so significantly in the school system that they can't cope with the ambiguity of the tertiary system. So we talk about the battle between that academic performer and maybe the grittier applied learner, the grittier applied learner is going to have the skills and capabilities to navigate that ambiguity outside the classroom. And so regardless of the pathway that they're going for, we need to be cultivating that sense of agency within the learners. Dan, I'm sorry, you can talk now.
I love that. We could stay here for another hour easily. I guess, Kyle, what I'd love to just kind of end on is, you spoke about shifting the needle. And for me, I love that analogy of it's not an on-off switch. You don't do it or you don't do it. It's like, what can we shine the light on? Use a dimmer switch. If you were to pick one or two of your shifts and say it's a great starting point for someone to do tomorrow, you mentioned earlier around asking a really good question. Do you have any other kind of like last advice around shifts to make for teachers in the room?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I just had a podcast interview with some Montessori adolescent people. I was asking the same thing, what can shift things and what's this first step maybe to take tomorrow? Take whatever your lesson is tomorrow, whatever your activity, whatever that particular thing is, and just have just 2 or 3 alternatives to whatever the activity is, teaching the same particular concept, color coordinate it, and say, here's the red, yellow, and green choices, around this particular thing. And if you need to introduce the concept and it's a follow-up piece of work, fine. If it's actually, they can come in and there's 3 different warm-ups that they can choose from, 3 different questions that they can respond to, that's already red, yellow, green. If it's, let's say it's math problems or something, right? And there's the challenge problems. Okay, you want to take the challenge, here's red, yellow, green level. Okay, it could be that. So color coordinate, 3 different options of whatever you're going to go in tomorrow and do, and just give that level of choice, see where kids gravitate towards. And I'd say this also might be an experiment for you too. If you have rows all facing the front, put them into tables, kids will come in, they'll be like, what's going on? Have the 3 choices, something up front that just says there's 3 choices for your work today. Sit down and one of the ones that compels you. If you have to then do an intro, that's fine. But now they're already sitting and maybe in different places where they chose and choosing some work that they'd like to do. And that's a start.
Great. Thank you. And there's going to be so much more in your book. Where is the teacher? Of course, we'll give away some copies to our super engaged people in the chat. Kyle, thank you so much for your time, for gifting us your presence in this live learning. It's been a really great conversation. We'll pull it all together and send out a post-session email to all of our those that are registered tomorrow. So yeah, thank you so much. I'd love to kind of preview the next live learning session coming up for July. Super exciting. 3 leading voices in education in Australia. So our own Nick Dyson, Luca
2
Parry.
and then me.
2 and then, well, no, don't
2 and then
yourself,
me.
Nick. But look, Nick Dyson, Luca Parry, Selena Fisk are coming together to bring together a new way of doing professional learning, strategy, data, and the future of learning in classrooms all together. It's called Informed Futures. It's super exciting. We're going to preview it in the next live learning session. So I can't wait for that conversation. But for the moment, thank you so much for joining us on this Wednesday evening. Kyle, if you're not sure, here in Queensland, particularly if you're Queensland or New South Wales, there is a big football game on right now. It's about to start, so there might be a few people racing away to see that. But thanks for your time, everybody. Take care, and we'll see you next time.